What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ask Me Anything series. I hope everyone had a fantastic weekend, and as always, huge shout out to everyone who sent in a question. Even if your question isn't featured in this episode, just know I read them all, and I appreciate all of you guys. And with that being said, let's go ahead and start off this episode with a question from Drew Ruff, who says, thoughts on the Hawks hiring Jeff Blashill? I think it's a fine hire by the Blackhawks. It's no secret that Jeff Blashill's tenure as head coach of the Red Wings was very bad, but at the end of the day, he never really had much to work with in Detroit. He took over that job as Red Wings head coach at a time where we all knew the playoff streak was going to soon come to an end, and that the Red Wings were going to be entering a long and grueling rebuild. I think the biggest complaint Red Wings fans had when it came to Jeff Blashill throughout his tenure as Red Wings head coach is that it felt like opportunities were really hard to come by for prospects and young players. Meanwhile, you had guys like Justin Abdelkader, Franz Nielsen, Valtteri Filppula, aging veterans who were on the back nine of their career, being in the lineup every night, getting top 6 minutes despite the fact that they were all pretty bad. But when you look back and think about some of the names that us Red Wings fans were clamoring for to get more opportunities, it was guys like Dennis Cholowski, Evgeny Svechnikov, Filip Zadina, Michael Rasmussen, Joe Veleno, all players who at this point I think it's safe to say their careers wouldn't look any different than they look right now no matter who was the Red Wings head coach during that time. And when the Red Wings finally started to land some can't miss prospects, guys like Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond, I think Jeff Blashill handled them fine. In his final season as head coach of the Red Wings, Moritz Seider won the Calder Trophy, and Lucas Raymond had a fantastic rookie season as well, playing on pretty much exclusively the first line. So at the end of the day, I do feel like his tenure as Red Wings head coach is often overhated, and no matter who was head coach of the Red Wings during that time, it wasn't going to be pretty. And obviously, since leaving Detroit, Jeff Blashill has gained some very valuable experience serving as Tampa Bay's assistant coach for 3 seasons, learning from John Cooper, who is one of the better head coaches in the league. And Jeff Blashill is also somebody who has a lot of experience as a head coach on the international stage, so I do feel like it was probably time he got another look as an NHL head coach. Moving on now to the next question. This one comes from Golf Legends, who says, will Crosby and the Penguins make another run before the retirements of Crosby, Letang, and Malkin? I could see them having a few more seasons where they're in the hunt for a playoff spot, but I think the chances of the Penguins becoming a legit Stanley Cup contender again with guys like Crosby, Malkin, and Letang on the roster are slim to none. Now, they do have over $24 million in projected cap space this offseason with all of their important core pieces already signed through next season, so they could definitely be very aggressive in free agency. They also have a ton of draft picks in the first 3 rounds of the next 3 NHL drafts, but in my opinion, they should not be using draft picks as trade bait unless it's for young NHL proven players that can come in and make an impact right away, but also potentially be long-term pieces for them too. I'm sure the Penguins front office is dying to give guys like Crosby, Malkin, and Letang another crack at competing for a Stanley Cup, but at the end of the day, if you're the Penguins, I think you still need to be prioritizing the future and continuing to build off of the work that they've done over the last year and a half, stockpiling draft picks and maintaining cap flexibility. Moving on now to the next question. This one comes from Hayden Hallett, who says, if the Canes get swept again, would it be time for the Hurricanes to either retool and or fire Rod Brind'Amour? This has been a pretty hot topic of discussion over the last few days. The Eastern Conference Finals have been very lopsided for the most part in favor of the Florida Panthers, and the Hurricanes now find themselves 0-11 in the Eastern Conference Finals under Rod Brind'Amour. Now, when it comes to them retooling, I think you can make the argument that they already have. Their roster today looks a lot different than it did last year. Guys like Brett Pesce and Brady Shea left in free agency, and then they brought in Ghost and Walker, Teuvo Teravainen, Michael Bunting, Stefan Nason, all players who are no longer on the team as well. And for the most part, a lot of the players that Carolina brought in to replace those guys have done really well. Depth never really seems to be an issue for the Hurricanes. They're always a strong defensive team and usually get pretty consistent goaltending. But the one thing that I think this team clearly lacks is game-breaking offensive talent. Sebastian Aho, Andrei Svechnikov, Seth Jarvis are all fantastic players, but they're not really the kind of players who have that ability to just take over big playoff games and dramatically shift a series, especially against a team like the Florida Panthers. And the Hurricanes have tried to go out and bring in those game-breaking offensive players. Last year, we saw them acquire Jake Gensel. He then ended up leaving in free agency. This year, they brought in Mikko Rantanen in a blockbuster trade, and it felt like he is exactly the kind of player this team has been lacking. And then obviously we know how that turned out. Mikko Rantanen wasn't willing to sign in Carolina long term. Thankfully, they were able to flip him and recoup some assets before the trade deadline. And I do want to say this in defense of players like Aho, Svechnikov, and Seth Jarvis. The Florida Panthers have also made players like Nikita Kucherov and Austin Matthews look very average in these playoffs. I feel like maybe this Eastern Conference Finals series just says more about the Florida Panthers than it does the Carolina Hurricanes. Like, the Panthers are just an absolute juggernaut. I think no matter the outcome of this series, the Hurricanes should try and have at least one more kick at the can next season with this core and with Rod Brind'Amour behind the bench, because for the most part, all of their most important players are already signed through next season, and they still have almost $30 million in projected cap space. And they also have those 2 first-round draft picks that they got along with Logan Stankoven in the Rantanen trade that they could use as trade bait. If players like Mitch Marner and Nikolai Ehlers do hit the open market on July 1st, I think Carolina is a team that should definitely be in on those guys and trying to bring at least one of them in. And depending on what the Boston Bruins plan is moving forward, if this little retool that they're in turns into a full-on rebuild, if I'm the Hurricanes, I'm calling and I'm trying to do everything I possibly can to bring in somebody like David Pastrnak, because with those additional first-round draft picks they got from Dallas in the Rantanen trade, they could definitely put together a huge trade package for a superstar player like Pastrnak. 3 first-round picks, Jackson Blake, Scott Morrow, something like that. Now, if the Hurricanes are in fact able to load up this offseason and they fall short in the playoffs again next year, then I think it's probably time to make a huge change like moving on from Brind'Amour. This next question comes from Mikey, who says, can you see the Sharks making a big move this offseason, i.e. signing Marner, Ehlers, or trading for Dobson? Mike Grier has said he wants to start coming out of this rebuild, and they have a lot of cap space, and I think acquiring a big name could really help them start to come out of this rebuild. I could definitely see the Sharks looking to go big game hunting this offseason. The hard part of the rebuild is already over. They have their franchise talents in Macklin Celebrini, and at the draft they're going to be landing another can't-miss prospect like Schaefer, Hagens, or Misa. So if Mike Grier is serious about wanting to speed up this process, it makes a whole lot of sense for the Sharks to be in on guys like Ehlers and Marner. They have no shortage of cap space as to where they could make a serious play for not just one of, but both of those guys if they wanted to. One thing I will say about the Sharks, though, is if they're not able to land one of those top of the lineup players like an Ehlers or Marner, I don't think they should immediately just shift and panic and try and overpay for a middle 6 forward or a second pairing defenseman, because you don't want to get stuck in a situation similar to the one that the Red Wings are in right now, where Steve Yzerman kind of did what we're talking about here with Mike Grier doing. He went out and tried to speed up the rebuilding process by bringing in guys like Andrew Kopp, JT Compher, and Ben Sherratt. And now here we are in 2025. None of those players have ever really been much of a needle mover for the Red Wings at all. And honestly, given their contracts are all probably viewed around the league as negative assets at a time where the Red Wings are knocking on the door of getting back into the playoffs, but just can't get over that hump. So if you're the Sharks, I think you really want to avoid putting yourself in that position. If you can bring in a can't-miss top-of-the-lineup player who you know what you're going to get from, someone like Marner, Ehlers, you do that. If they aren't able to bring in players like that, I think they just stick with the process. Obviously, they are going to have to sign some guys just to hit the cap floor, but don't do that by giving 5-6-year big money deals to middle-of-the-lineup players. This next question comes from Jake, who says, where is Marchand gonna be next year? Back with Florida, surprise retirement, back to Boston, maybe Montreal. I said this in a recent video, I'll say it again here. I really think Brad Marchand ends up re-signing in Florida. He has been a fantastic fit on that team. I think being on a perennial Stanley Cup contender to close out his career is important to Brad Marchand, or he wouldn't have left Boston. And the no state tax in warm weather is a nice added bonus too. So I really think Brad Marchand just ends up staying in Florida. Moving on to the next question. This one comes from Joshua. Some more free agent talk here. Straight up, where does Mitch Marner end up next season? As a Red Wings fan, I really want to say Detroit, but I think he ends up signing with a smaller market team after dealing with the media circus that is Toronto throughout the entirety of his career so far. I think it's pretty clear that Mitch Marner is a guy who doesn't really do well with all that added pressure. We just talked about San Jose and then potentially going after Marner. I think they make some sense. Anaheim is another one that I think makes a ton of sense. but if I had to make an exact prediction, I'm going to go with the LA Kings. They're a team that have lost to the Edmonton Oilers in the first round now for 4 consecutive seasons. They need to do something to try and get over the hump, so I'm going to say that's where Mitch Marner ends up signing. Moving on now to the next question. This one comes from Wonder Love, who says, with July 1st coming up, do you think we will see any massive long-term extensions for some of the 2023 drafted players? Bedard, Fantilli would be my first thoughts for a long-term extension. I mean, yeah, if I'm Chicago and Columbus, I am doing anything I possibly can to try and get those guys signed to long-term extensions as soon as possible. I think waiting until next offseason would be a mistake. Let's say Bedard pops off and becomes a 90-point player, same with Adam Fantilli, and then you have the cap jumping again next offseason. I mean, you're probably going to have to pay them a lot more than you would have to if you locked them up this offseason. And I'd say the same thing about guys like Leo Carlsson and Zach Benson, who are also from that 2023 draft. This next question comes from Sith Slayer, who says, do you think the Jets should let Ehlers walk to clear up cap for depth or other re-signings such as Velarde? As a Jets fan, Ehlers is my favorite player and has been for a while, so it'd be sad to see him leave, but it is a real possibility. I know we've talked about Marner and Ehlers a lot already in this video, but another thing I want to say is I don't feel the same way about Nikolai Ehlers and his future at Winnipeg that I feel about Mitch Marner and his future in Toronto. I honestly think there's like a 99% chance that Mitch Marner's done in Toronto, but when it comes to Ehlers, I'm definitely not ruling out the possibility of him re-signing in Winnipeg. At the Jets' end-of-season media availability, GM Kevin Cheveldayoff said that he's prepared to make a pitch to Ehlers and his agent that would make Ehlers a Jet for life, which tells me that he is prepared to offer him a big 8-year contract. And when you look at the Jets' cap situation, even with big RFAs like Dylan Sandberg and Gabe Velarde, they could make it work. They have over $26 million in projected cap space. Let's say an 8-year deal for Ehlers comes in at a cap hit of around $8 or $8.5 million. That still leaves the Jets with more than enough cap space to be able to bring in some depth pieces and to re-sign their 2 big RFAs in Gabe Velarde and Dylan Sandberg. This next question comes from Gibby, who says, until 2017, the way the MLB did their All-Star games was American League versus National League, and the winner will have home field advantage in the World Series regardless of the standings. Do you think the NHL should adopt a similar format or rule to make the NHL All-Star game a bit more interesting and to make it count for something? Winning conference/division will get home ice advantage in the Stanley Cup Finals regardless of the standings. I think we all want to see the NHL do something to make the All-Star game more interesting, but honestly, I'm not sure what you do. I don't think this is it. I think this would honestly be ridiculous. I feel like there's a reason the MLB stopped doing this. Home field advantage in the World Series or home ice advantage in the Stanley Cup Finals is something that is way too important to be decided on in an All-Star game. Like, let's say the team that won the President's Trophy during the regular season made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, and they were going up against a Cinderella story team that just squeaked into the playoffs, but because of who won the All-Star game, the team that just squeaked into the playoffs gets home ice advantage over the President's Trophy winners. I think that is absurd. Again, we all want to see the All-Star game be more competitive and have more meaning, but I just don't think that's ever going to happen. This next question comes from K.A. Booth, who says, what do you think an ideal trade for Marco Rossi would look like for the Wild? I personally don't want Rossi to be traded, but with the way things are going, I think it's inevitable he gets traded in the offseason. I'm right there with you. I don't really understand why Marco Rossi's name is consistently thrown around in trade rumors. I mean, at just 23 years old, he's already a 60-point top 6 center. If I'm Minnesota, that's somebody that I want to keep around long term, but it sounds like maybe Minnesota doesn't want to commit to him long term. As far as what an ideal trade package for Marco Rossi would look like, it all just depends on what the Minnesota Wild are looking for. Considering the fact that they were a playoff team this year, I can't imagine that they'd only be looking for, draft picks and prospects. So honestly, I feel like it's really hard to say. Maybe a swap for another young player who's already relatively established at the NHL level could make some sense, but I'm not sure exactly who that would be. And now finally, finishing up this episode with a question from Habs fan who says, who do you think the Habs should target for a second line center this offseason? When you look at their cap situation, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to land a second line center in free agency. Like, I think someone like Sam Bennett would be a great fit on a young team like Montreal as, a veteran presence with a lot of playoff experience. But unless Montreal is able to move out a contract like Josh Anderson or Brendan Gallagher before free agency, I just don't see that happening. We just talked about Marco Rossi and what a trade package for him could look like. I think Montreal would make a ton of sense as a team that should target Marco Rossi. At just 23 years old, he would fit right in with the strong young core that Montreal has already built. As far as what kind of package they could put together for Marco Rossi, I mean, they have the 16th and 17th overall pick in the upcoming draft. So maybe one of those picks and someone like Kirby Dach, but even then, I don't know if that's enough. I can't imagine Kirby Dach is somebody with a ton of trade value right now. But if they could find a way to make it work, I think Marco Rossi is a name that definitely makes a whole lot of sense for Montreal given where they're at right now and their need for a second line center. So that is going to wrap up this episode of the Ask Me Anything series. Like I said at the beginning of the video, huge thanks and shout out to everyone who sent in a question, even if your question wasn't featured in this episode. I read them all and I appreciate all of you guys. If you made it all this way to the end of the video and you ended up enjoying yourself, please remember to leave a like. It's the best way to let me know that you enjoyed, and it does help out the videos a ton. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all year round, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you all again soon.